Hello guys. If you like our content and you love scary stories, then subscribe, like, and write in the comments your scary stories so that we write your story. Scary viewing and terrifying sensations to you. The Silent Town, a Haunting of Centralia. Part 1, The Fire Beneath. The story of Centralia, Pennsylvania, begins in the early 1960s, though its roots stretch back further. Centralia was a quiet coal mining town, nestled in the heart of Pennsylvania. Its residents led simple lives, relying on the coal mines that ran beneath the town for their livelihoods. But beneath the town's peaceful exterior, something sinister was brewing, something that would turn Centralia into one of the most haunted and desolate places in America. It all started with a fire. In May 1962, a seemingly small event occurred that would change the fate of the town forever. The town council decided to clean up the landfill, which was located near the old coal mines. They set the trash ablaze, thinking it would be an easy way to get rid of the waste. But what they didn't realize was that the fire would spread into the labyrinth of abandoned coal mines beneath the town. The fire found its way into a seam of anthracite coal, and what began as a small, controlled blaze quickly turned into an uncontrollable underground inferno. The fire spread through the coal veins, burning hotter and deeper as it went. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but the fire continued to burn. The townspeople grew concerned as the ground beneath them became increasingly unstable. Strange things began to happen. Houses started to lean, sinkholes appeared out of nowhere, and smoke billowed from the cracks in the earth. At first, the town council tried to ignore the problem, hoping it would resolve itself. But as the situation worsened, it became clear that the fire was not going to go out on its own. The federal government stepped in, but their efforts to extinguish the fire proved futile. The fire had spread too far and too deep. As the fire burned beneath Centralia, it began to affect the lives of the townspeople in more ways than one. The air was thick with the smell of burning coal, and the ground was hot to the touch. People began to fall ill, suffering from headaches, nausea, and respiratory problems. But the worst was yet to come. The fire wasn't just destroying the town physically, it was awakening something much darker beneath the surface. Part 2, The Warnings Ignored. The residents of Centralia were not immediately aware of the true danger they were in. The fire beneath the town was not just a natural disaster, it was something far more sinister. As the fire continued to burn, strange and terrifying things began to happen. People started to see things that shouldn't be there: ghostly figures, shadows moving in the smoke, and strange, flickering lights in the distance. One of the first to notice these strange occurrences was a man named John Conway, a lifelong resident of Centralia. John had lived in the town his entire life, and he knew every inch of it. But as the fire spread, he began to feel that something was terribly wrong. He would walk the streets at night and see shadows moving where there should be none. He heard whispers in the darkness, voices that seemed to come from the very ground beneath his feet. At first, John tried to dismiss these things as his imagination, but the occurrences grew more frequent and more disturbing. One night, while walking home from the local bar, John saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man, but something was off. The figure was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and his face was obscured by the smoke. John called out to him, but the figure didn't respond. As John got closer, the figure seemed to dissolve into the smoke, leaving behind only the faint smell of burning coal. John wasn't the only one experiencing these strange events. Many of the townspeople began to report seeing ghostly figures and hearing strange noises at night. Children would wake up screaming, claiming they saw someone standing in their room, only for their parents to find nothing there. Pets would refuse to go outside, barking and growling at seemingly nothing. The town's priest, Father O'Malley, was one of the few who believed that something supernatural was happening. He tried to warn the townspeople, telling them that the fire had awakened something evil beneath the town. But most people dismissed him as a crackpot, refusing to believe that anything more than a fire was at work. As the fire continued to burn, the town of Centralia became a ghost town in more ways than one. People started to leave, fearing for their safety. But those who stayed behind would soon realize that the real danger wasn't just the fire, it was what the fire had unleashed. Part 3: The Vanishing. As the fire beneath Centralia raged on, the town became more and more desolate. The government declared the area unsafe and began to buy out the residents, offering them compensation to leave their homes. Many took the offer, packing up and leaving the only home they had ever known. But some refused to go. These were the people who had lived in Centralia all their lives, who couldn't imagine living anywhere else. They were the ones who stayed behind, even as the town crumbled around them. But as the town emptied out, something strange began to happen. People started to disappear. At first, it was just a few isolated incidents: a man who went out for a walk and never came back, a woman who vanished while tending to her garden. The police chalked it up to the unstable ground, assuming that these people had fallen into sinkholes or been overcome by toxic fumes. But as more and more people disappeared, it became clear that something else was happening. One of the first to vanish was a young boy named Tommy Gorman. Tommy was just 10 years old, and he loved to explore the woods around Centralia. One day he went out to play and never came back. His parents searched for him, but there was no trace of the boy. The police organized a search party, but after days of searching, they found nothing. A few weeks later, an elderly woman named Mrs. Parker disappeared from her home. Her neighbor, Mrs. Carlson, reported hearing strange noises coming from the Parker house the night before, loud thumps and what sounded like whispers. When Mrs. Carlson went to check on her the next morning, she found the door wide open and Mrs. Parker's house empty. There was no sign of a struggle and no indication of where the old woman had gone. As more people vanished, the remaining residents of Centralia began to panic. They were living in a town that was quite literally falling apart, with a fire burning beneath their feet and people disappearing without a trace. But despite the fear, some still refused to leave. They believed that the disappearances were just accidents, that the fire would eventually burn out and things would go back to normal. They couldn't have been more wrong. Part 4: The Underground. One of the last people to disappear was a man named Richard Thompson. Richard was a miner, one of the few who had stayed in Centralia to try and keep the mines running despite the fire. He was a quiet man with few friends, but he was known for his determination and his refusal to give up. Even as the town emptied out and the mines became increasingly dangerous, Richard kept working. He believed that the fire could be contained, that the town could be saved. One night, Richard went down into the mines to check on the fire. He was never seen again. When the other miners realized that Richard was missing, they organized a search party. They went down into the mines, following the tunnels that had become so familiar to them. But as they descended deeper into the earth, they began to notice strange things. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around them. They heard whispers, faint and distant, as if coming from deep within the earth. One of the miners, a man named George, swore he saw something moving in the darkness, a shadowy figure that seemed to melt into the walls. The miners eventually found Richard's tools, abandoned at the end of one of the tunnels. But there was no sign of Richard. The ground was hot to the touch, and the air was thick with smoke. The miners knew that they couldn't stay down there much longer, so they turned back, leaving Richard behind. But as they made their way back to the surface, the tunnels began to change. The familiar path they had taken for years seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. The walls were no longer solid rock, but seemed to pulse and breathe as if they were alive. The whispers grew louder, and the miners felt a growing sense of dread. It was as if the very earth was trying to swallow them whole. When they finally emerged from the mines, the miners were pale and shaken. They knew that something terrible had happened down there, something beyond their understanding. They refused to go back, and the mines were abandoned for good. Richard Thompson was never found, and his disappearance marked the beginning of the end for Centralia. Part 5: The Haunting. With the mines abandoned and the town nearly deserted, Centralia became a ghost town in every sense of the word. The few remaining residents lived in fear, knowing that something terrible was happening beneath their feet but unable to leave their homes. The fire continued to burn, and the ground grew more unstable by the day. But the worst part was the silence. The town that had once been filled with the sounds of life was now eerily quiet, save for the occasional rumble of the earth beneath them. But the silence was deceptive. At night, when the town was shrouded in darkness, the whispers would start. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder as the night wore on. The whispers seemed to come from the very ground, as if the earth itself was speaking. The words were unintelligible, but they carried a sense of dread that was impossible to ignore. Those who stayed in Centralia began to see things that shouldn't be there. Shadows moved in the corners of their vision, and figures appeared in the smoke that rose from the cracks in the earth. Some claimed to see the ghosts of those who had disappeared, wandering the empty streets in search of something they could never find. Others saw visions of fire and brimstone, as if they were glimpsing into the very heart of the inferno beneath them. One night, a woman named Mary Walker was woken by the sound of footsteps in her house. At first, she thought it was her husband, but when she called out to him, there was no answer. She got out of bed and went to check, but the house was empty. As she walked down the hallway, she felt a cold breeze, and the whispers began. They were louder than ever before, and they seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. Mary turned to go back to her room, but she froze when she saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man, but his face was obscured by smoke. He stood there for a moment, staring at her, before disappearing into the darkness. Mary screamed, and her husband came running, but there was no sign of the figure. The next morning, they found that the floorboards where the figure had stood were burned, as if someone had set fire to them. The haunting of Centralia had begun. Part 6: The Warning. As the fire continued to burn and the hauntings grew more frequent, the remaining residents of Centralia began to receive strange warnings. They came in the form of dreams, visions, and strange occurrences that couldn't be explained. People would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. One of the first to receive such a warning was a man named James Hartman. James was one of the few who had stayed in Centralia, refusing to leave despite the danger. He was a stubborn man, set in his ways, and he didn't believe in ghosts or hauntings. But that changed one night when he had a dream that shook him to his core. In the dream, James was standing in the middle of Centralia, but the town was different. The buildings were on fire, and the ground was cracked and scorched. The air was thick with smoke, and the sky was a deep blood red. As James looked around, he saw the figures of those who had disappeared, wandering aimlessly through the burning town. They were all staring at him, their eyes empty and hollow. Suddenly, the ground beneath him began to shake, and a deep, rumbling voice filled the air. The voice was like nothing James had ever heard before, deep, guttural, and filled with malice. It spoke a single word: leave. James woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to dismiss the dream as just that, a dream, but the feeling of dread lingered. The next day, he noticed something strange. The ground around his house was hot to the touch, and small cracks had begun to form in the foundation. The air was thick with the smell of burning coal, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. That night, the dream came again, and this time it was even more vivid. The town was burning, and the figures were closer now, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The voice spoke again, louder and more insistent. "Leave." James woke up in a panic, and he knew he couldn't stay in Centralia any longer. He packed his things and left the town that night, driving as fast as he could away from the burning ground and the voices that haunted his dreams. He was one of the last to leave Centralia, and he never looked back. Part 7: The Final Days. As more and more people left Centralia, the town became even more desolate. The government had declared the area uninhabitable, and the few remaining residents were urged to leave. But there were still those who refused, clinging to their homes despite the danger. Among the last to stay was a man named Henry Dawson. Henry was an old man, and Centralia was the only home he had ever known. He had lived through the worst of the fire, and he wasn't about to leave now. He was stubborn and set in his ways, and he didn't believe in the hauntings that others spoke of. To him, the fire was just a natural disaster, something that could be endured. But as the town grew emptier, Henry began to notice strange things. The air was always hot and thick with smoke, and the ground was unstable. He would hear whispers at night, faint and distant, but growing louder with each passing day. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and he would catch glimpses of figures in the smoke, figures that disappeared as soon as he turned to look. One night, Henry was sitting in his living room, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that had settled over him. The ground beneath him rumbled, as it often did, but this time it was different. The rumbling grew louder, and the walls of his house began to shake. Henry got up to check outside, but as he reached the door, he felt a cold breeze blow through the room. When he turned around, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing in the middle of his living room was a figure tall, dark, and shrouded in smoke. The figure's face was obscured, but its eyes burned with a fiery intensity. It stared at Henry for what felt like an eternity, before slowly raising its hand and pointing towards the door. Henry didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his coat and ran out of the house, not stopping until he was far away from the town. As he looked back, he saw the figure standing in the doorway, watching him leave. It was the last time Henry ever saw his home, and the last time he ever set foot in Centralia. Part 8: The Abandonment. With Henry's departure, Centralia was all but abandoned. The government declared the town a disaster area, and all remaining residents were forcibly relocated. The roads leading into the town were blocked off, and the buildings were left to decay. The fire continued to burn, but now there was no one left to witness its destruction. Centralia became a ghost town, a place where time seemed to stand still. The streets were empty, the buildings crumbling, and the air was thick with the smell of burning coal. The fire beneath the town raged on, unstoppable and uncontainable. The ground was hot to the touch, and smoke rose from the cracks in the earth. But despite its desolation, Centralia was not empty. The hauntings continued, growing stronger as the town grew emptier. Those who ventured into Centralia reported seeing ghostly figures, hearing strange noises, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers in the night were louder now, and the shadows moved with a life of their own. One of the few who dared to enter Centralia was a journalist named Sarah Mills. Sarah had heard the stories of the haunted town and was determined to uncover the truth. She drove into Centralia one evening, determined to spend the night and document her experiences. But what she found was far more terrifying than she could have imagined. As Sarah walked through the empty streets, she felt an overwhelming sense of unease. The air was thick with smoke, and the ground beneath her feet was hot. The buildings were crumbling, their windows shattered, and the streets were eerily silent. But it was the feeling of being watched that unsettled her the most. She could feel eyes on her, but every time she turned around, there was nothing there. Sarah set up camp in one of the abandoned houses, determined to spend the night. But as the sun set and darkness fell, the town came to life. The whispers began, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing minute. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and Sarah could feel a presence in the room with her. She tried to document what she was experiencing, but her hands were shaking too badly to hold the camera steady. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and Sarah could see her breath in the air. The whispers grew louder, and she could hear footsteps coming down the hallway. Terrified, Sarah grabbed her things and ran out of the house, not stopping until she reached her car. As she drove away from Centralia, she looked in the rearview mirror and saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, watching her leave. Sarah never returned to Centralia, and she never spoke of what she experienced that night. But her story spread, adding to the legend of the haunted town. Part 9: The Legend Grows. As the years passed, Centralia became more than just a ghost town, it became a legend. People from all over the country came to see the haunted town, drawn by the stories of ghostly figures and strange occurrences. But those who ventured into Centralia often came back with more than just stories, they came back with scars. Many who visited the town reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they were being watched by unseen eyes. Some claimed to see figures in the smoke or hear whispers in the night. Others reported more terrifying experiences, visions of fire and brimstone, or encounters with shadowy figures that seemed to follow them home. One such visitor was a man named Tom Harris. Tom had heard the stories of Centralia and was curious to see if they were true. He drove into the town one evening, determined to spend the night and see for himself if the town was truly haunted. At first, Tom found nothing unusual. The town was empty and desolate, the buildings crumbling and the streets silent. But as night fell, he began to feel uneasy. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift and move. The smell of burning coal was overpowering, and Tom could hear faint whispers in the distance. He tried to ignore the feeling of dread that was creeping over him, but it was impossible. The whispers grew louder, and Tom could see shadows moving out of the corner of his eye. He decided to leave, but as he made his way back to his car, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure tall, dark, and shrouded in smoke. The figure had no face, but its eyes burned with a fiery intensity. It stood there, watching Tom, as if daring him to come closer. Terrified, Tom turned and ran, not stopping until he was far away from the town. But the figure haunted his dreams, appearing night after night in his sleep. Tom never spoke of what he saw in Centralia, but the experience left him scarred for life. The legend of Centralia continued to grow, and the town became a place of fear and fascination. People came from all over to see the haunted town, but few stayed for long. The fire continued to burn, and the hauntings grew stronger, as if the town itself was alive with some dark and malevolent force. Part 10: The Final Warning. Centralia remains a ghost town to this day, a place where time seems to stand still. The fire beneath the town still burns, unstoppable and uncontainable. The ground is hot, the air thick with smoke, and the streets are empty and desolate. But despite its desolation, Centralia is not empty. The hauntings continue, growing stronger with each passing year. Those who dare to enter Centralia today are met with the same sense of dread that has haunted the town for decades. The whispers in the night are louder, the shadows move with a life of their own, and the figures in the smoke are more vivid than ever. It is as if the town itself is warning visitors to stay away, to leave before it is too late. But the warning goes unheeded, and people continue to visit the haunted town, drawn by the stories of ghostly figures and strange occurrences. Some come for the thrill, others for the chance to see something supernatural. But those who come to Centralia rarely leave unchanged. For Centralia is more than just a ghost town, it is a place of darkness, where the line between the living and the dead is blurred. The fire that burns beneath the town has awakened something ancient and malevolent, something that feeds on fear and despair. And as long as the fire burns, the hauntings will continue. So if you ever find yourself in Centralia, remember this: the town is not abandoned. It is very much alive, with the ghosts of the past and the fire of the present. And it is always watching, waiting for its next victim. Leave while you still can.